Hello and welcome to our Florida podcast. I'm Kaylee and with me is my sister Maegan. On Mondays, I share my love of Florida history and a really cool story of something that happened in our state. And on Fridays, Maegan shares some unique Florida ecology, talks about some cute Florida critters. And the idea is that whether you're a seasoned Floridian like us or you're a new transplant, that everyone listening will cultivate a deeper love and understanding of our unique state, and we can recreate and protect our state together. So that's our mission. All right, Maegan, are you ready to get started?
It's the goal. I am so ready.
Awesome.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so I had told Maegan ahead of time that we were talking about St. Augustine so she could plan her Friday podcast around that, but I did not tell her specifically what we were talking about. So today we are talking about the first legally established free Black settlement in what would eventually become the United States of America, Fort Mose. Now, Fort Mose is located in St. Augustine, Florida, and was first established by the Spanish specifically as a free Black community in 1738. Now, if you're a bit of a history buff, you might notice that 1738 is about 125 years before the emancipation of slavery in the U.S. So 125 years before slavery is ended in the U.S., this pocket in Florida is established as this haven, this free community for Black people to come to. So today we're going to cover the fort's unique history, as well as the history of free, escaped, and enslaved Africans in the colony, which would eventually become the state of Florida, all the way from 1513 to 1763. So from 1513 to 1763, we're talking about covering 250 years.
A lot of years,
no, the fort wasn't around that long, unfortunately. The fort was only around for like 40 or 50 years. That my math might be bad. I was looking at a lot of dates. But then as I got into it, I started realizing that the history of Africans in Florida goes way back beyond slavery, and they've been here the entire time. And I think that's an aspect of history that's not really talked about. So to kind of add context to this, we're rolling all the way back to 1513. So according to the National Park Service website, the first Africans arrived with Ponce de Leon in 1513. In 1565, the city of St. Augustine is founded. Africans are part of this original colony, some as slaves, some as free individuals. Just like the other citizens of St. Augustine, they planted, sawed, built, and helped establish the colony and scraped out their own life and existence here. So pulling their weight just as much, if not more. In August of 1687, so we're skipping forward a very long, about 100 years. So in August of 1687, we have the first record, and so this isn't necessarily the first ones, but the first written record of escaped British slaves arriving to seek asylum in St. Augustine. So it was 11 people arrive in this dugout canoe on the Atlantic coast on Amelia Island. And so in that boat, we've got 8 men, 2 women, and a child who there seems to be some debate. Some sources say 3 years old, and other sources say 3 months old. Gotta love history and the way things get written down. Either way, it was a small child who was breastfeeding, and there were 11 people in that boat, and they were escaping British slavery because at the time, this is in 1687, the colonies to the north were still British owned. The United States of America does not exist at this time. So they had been working on a plantation in the Carolinas. So once again, like the state lines are all very different. And actually, I've got a picture for you. So that first slide shows how they were up in the Carolinas and they got in their dugout canoe and using the tidal creeks and everything along the salty marsh coast, the southeast what would become the U.S., they traveled down along the coast of the Carolinas, along the coast of Georgia, and eventually landed at Amelia Island to seek refuge.
Okay, so looking at the map, this is super interesting. Also, they definitely had, I was just seeing here, like, it's got West Florida and East Florida.
Yeah.
And so they had it broken up, like, maybe it's not, well, no, it kind of looks like it's broken up.
It is. It looks like
as well.
And where the panhandle is like West Florida.
Yeah. And then the rest of Florida is just all considered like.
And Georgia is like half in Alabama. Alabama, I don't think's a thing yet. So yeah, like the lines are totally different.
My next question, yeah.
The stuff that was so Florida is Spanish owned, and then north of that is British owned. So they were escaping British slavery of the colonies. And this was in 1687. So
Wow, that's
yeah,
crazy.
they arrived at the Santa Maria Franciscan mission, and you guys will have to forget my Spanish. I took 4 years, but you can't tell. I can't tell. Soldiers that arrived, there were soldiers stationed there, and they're like, "Oh, okay, well we'll go talk to the governor." So they go to Governor Diego de Quiroga to see how to handle the situations, and at that point, the Africans boarded another boat and came to St. Augustine, landing there in October. We know from public records that one of the women was baptized right away because she was extremely, extremely ill, and so like part of and so also not Catholic, so forgive me, but she was baptized right away because the thought was that she might die and therefore she should be baptized so she, could go to heaven and all that. It does appear that that woman pulled through. So both of the women ended up working at the governor's house. And then the 8 men that came on that boat proceeded to work on building of Castillo de San Marcos. So that's the big castle. When you look at St. Augustine or you look at pictures of St. Augustine, they were working on building that. That's how far back this is.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's also a
crazy.
chance too, there are some records or some thoughts that maybe 2 of the men went and worked as blacksmiths instead, actually, which would show that they had skilled labor.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the women worked in the governor's house. The baby was able to stay with its mother. It seemed like everyone was compensated for their labor, so everyone was paid, even though it was technically uncertain for them if they would be free at this time. So there was no real precedent for kind of surrendering to this European power. They weren't sure if they were going to actually be considered free and have all of the same rights as a citizen, but they were being paid and compensated for their labor, and it seems like it was obviously they risked a lot to come, and it was absolutely worth it to them. According to the National Park Service website, when an English official arrived the next fall to claim them, Governor Quiroga refused to release them on the grounds that they had been converted to Catholicism, had married in the town, and were usefully employed. So British guy comes sorry, I'm taking my property back. And they're like, sorry, no, these are Catholic people. They're citizens. No. They're hardworking.
Citizens.
Yeah. So in 1693, so now we're 6 years later from when they first arrived, Spanish King Charles II issues a royal decree granting freedom and protection to all enslaved Africans escaping British colonies as long as they convert to Catholicism and serve Spain. So...
Okay, and so...
No, go ahead.
Sorry. So they're escaping from where?
So they're escaping from the British colonies to the north. Georgia, Carolinas, Virginias. Yep.
Well, make sure I'm on the same page, because then you said Spain, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm on the same page
anymore.
It
gets so weird, okay. And I was reading through stuff last night, and I was like, wait, how is that possible? Because then it became British, and Florida switches hands so many times. Yeah, it was so
weird that Georgia was British, and and then Florida, of course, was Spanish for a very long time, too. It's very interesting how they flip back and forth. And I'm like, are we still in the U.S.? Are we out of the U.S. now? Where are we at, per se?
We're still in
because it's a weird
the same territory. It's just that what is Georgia and Virginia and Carolinas is British, and Florida is Spanish. And they have different rules.
So crazy to think about.
So, and this is kind of a great time to talk about the difference about slavery in Spain versus what was happening in the North and the British colonies. So in the American colonies and much of the Caribbean, and in certain cases Africa, there's what is called chattel slavery. So this is what we learned about in school, where slaves it's a racialized system. Black people from Africa are the slaves, and they're treated as nothing more than property. So they could be bought, sold, traded, used for labor, sex, and breeding. When they have children, those children belong to the master. You're treated no different than a piece of equipment or a piece of livestock. So that's chattel slavery. That's what's happening in Britain. Spain's view on slavery aligned more with the ancient Roman slavery. So Spain still has slaves, but it's a different system than like the chattel slavery that's going on to the north. So I think this is really important to acknowledge, because sometimes when we talk about slavery, it'll be said, well, slavery always existed. Slavery existed everywhere. Like, you got to judge people by their times, and just chattel slavery was what everyone thought was acceptable. But there were cultures prior in the past that were doing a more ethical version of slavery, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but still very different. And there were people at the time that were doing slavery different and much more humane. So Spain's take on slavery was more like that of ancient Rome. And in the 13th century, they established and followed the Castilian Code of Law, also known as the Siete Partidas. These laws were not based on race, and Africans joined slaves of other races and ethnicities who had been captured in just wars. So, equal opportunity slavery will take everybody, not just Black people. So, I don't want to present this as like everything's perfect.
Equal opportunity slavery.
But the Siete Partidas still held that slavery was an unnatural condition, for God had created man free, and it established ways in which enslaved people could become free. So there's still a very, very strong Catholic foundation to this, and the idea is that, well, no, God did create everyone equal, and therefore if people become Catholic and you're, brother in Christ, then like they should be free. Ways to achieve your freedom involved converting to Catholicism. It was viewed as the responsibility of masters in the church to teach slaves the rudiments of the faith so that they might be admitted into the church and enjoy all its sacraments. So one of those sacraments was marriage. So this means that marriage was sacred and ordained by God. So families cannot be broken up. Kids cannot be sold. So like there was more of a family unit here. So
it's more of a, I guess I want to say consequences. It's not consequences. It's more of like you can have this, but you're going to have to do this, this, and this, which is better than the latter, but still ideally not great. And I guess probably at the time there was like, okay, well, this is like a thought, like a well thought out thought, but like now that's not necessarily still that great either.
Even
I guess
the way to look at it is like, it's still slavery. It's still not great. People shouldn't own other people. That's never really been okay. However, there's a difference in a system that treats human beings as cattle and property, that breaks up family, that sells children, that convinces itself that this is okay. And then there's a difference in a system that goes, well, we know it's not really good, but you lost war, you lost this, whatever. So now you need to earn your freedom and you need to convert, which, I mean, you can also talk about, like, Spain is still doing atrocities. Like, the way that they're treating a lot of the indigenous cultures. Some of the missions are really good. Some of the missions are absolutely horrendous. So, like, it's very complicated, but it's important to know that there's a difference. And that's why there are people that are willing to risk everything to come further south and to try to escape the British, to come to Spain, or to come to Spain-held Florida. So in 1693, King Charles II says anyone that comes here will have the opportunity to be free, as long as they convert to Catholicism. In 1695, so 2 years later, the Castillo de San Marcos, the big fort at St. Augustine that everyone goes to, it's a national park site, is finished. And following the public record as far as like Africans in St. Augustine, we know that there were 11 people on payroll, 11 Africans on payroll for that. Now, in 1733, so this is now 40 years later, this is a different king. There's another royal decree from the Spanish crown reinforcing the offer of freedom, prohibiting the reimbursement of the English for escaped slaves, and requiring 4 years of service to the crown in order to become free. So what's happening there is they're just doubling down on that. Like, no, you can come here, you can convert to Catholicism, you can become free. We will not be paying the English reimbursement for you because you're not property, you're a person. And also, you're going to serve in the military for 4 years. I also kind of want to like point out that this is great. They're offering asylum. This is also a political move. The Union Army, Union Army in the U.S. did the same thing, where they said, "Oh, if you come here, if you escape, we will offer you freedom and asylum, but you're gonna fight in the Union Army, or you're going to fight in the Spanish Army," which is really important too, because you got to think like It's difficult to get new military over to Spain. It's still like they're doing everything they can to hold down, literally hold down the fort. Um, the British are coming in and sometimes attacking. And then you also sometimes have raids from pirates. So, like, the more armed men you have, the better off. Sometimes sending people, especially sending like Europeans over, like they're really susceptible to getting yellow fever. So people are getting sick. People are dying all the time. It's the early 1700s. So yeah, the idea of like, oh no, you just come here. We'll grant you freedom if you work for us for 4 years. It's a great deal for Spain too. So don't want to make them out as like these perfect moral heroes.
And I'm assuming it's probably not the easiest to get from like Georgia to Carolinas to Florida still, regardless of Spain offering this and again offering, and there's regulations essentially, but I'm assuming it's still not an easy journey.
You're
to get
making
from
my next point for me. Exactly. Here. So we talked about the first 11 citizens that came in the dugout canoe seeking asylum. That was something that continued to happen. So over the next, 50 years, people are finding their way to Spain. And you say finding their way, like they have to escape from their overseers, from the plantation that they're on. They have to outrun. They have to hide. That whole area that like people are coming through is swamp and marshland and heavily wooded. Like you don't have the interstate systems you have, but like when you're driving I-95 down through Georgia and you look out and it's just like all these marshes and it's muddy and there's water and it's like both really beautiful and also like, ugh, that's kind of gross. And it smells. That's what they're traveling through on foot and in canoe. There were some missions along the way. Like it seems like there might have been a mission in Georgia at one point that people might have been able to stop at for help. But also it also got shut down at some point. So I'm not sure how much that happened. We do know that the Yamasee Native Americans that were local to the areas would help people escape. And we also know, we know that people are coming to St. Augustine at this time and like entering public record, but there had been Maroon communities doing this for years. So are you familiar with Maroon communities at all? Okay.
No, honestly.
So I think this is just like the coolest thing. I actually listened to a couple of podcasts on it now. Maroon communities have existed pretty much as long as like slavery's existed. And it's when escaped slaves and indigenous people and Native Americans or like wherever they are kind of escape and go out into the middle of nowhere and like make a living for themselves. Because like it's very tough and it's hard to live in the middle of nowhere, but it's better than being a slave. And I just think it's such a
okay. It's kind of like what we call off-grid.
Yeah, they're going off-grid, but like they're going off-grid in like the 1700s.
But like 10 times harder.
And they're building their own resilient communities. They're holding up and they are defending themselves and their freedom. And I just think that's really, really cool. And I think it's something we don't really talk about too much. We're like, oh, slavery was bad and people just dealt with it. There were a lot of people. And that's why it's important to note too that Fort Mose is really cool because it's the first legally sanctioned free Black community. But there were other Maroon communities that were free Black communities. They just weren't technically legal. Their existence was illegal.
That is crazy.
Kind of crazy to think about. Like, oh yeah, I escaped slavery, but my existence here is illegal. Yeah.
That's insane.
All right. So that sort of starts its own underground railroad headed south, which is crazy because we learned about the Underground Railroad going from the Deep South heading north, trying to get people up into the Union and even up into Canada in like the 1800s. So 100 years before that Underground Railroad exists in that capacity, there is a Underground Railroad trying to get people to escape down to Spanish-controlled Florida. Yeah.
Wow.
It's also kind of crazy. Like, we talk about this, like, history repeats itself. No, literally 100 years before, this was already happening. And now 100 years later, it's going to happen again in the Civil War. Or, like, pre-Civil War.
Yeah, literally.
Dire. All right. So now, in 1738, so this is 50 years after our first group of 11 people arrived in St. Augustine in that dugout canoe. So 2 generations. So you're talking their grandkids. 50 years since the 10 adults and 1 toddler arrived, the St. Augustine governor, Manuel de Montiano, granted the freed slaves a plot of land where they could build their own settlement and fort. So we're at Fort Mose now. The settlement would be known as Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, or Fort Mose. The community at Fort Mose housed 38 men and their families and totaled about 100 people. The fort was described as earthen-walled with Indian-type thatched huts. So definitely not the coquina stone that we're familiar with in the much larger Castillo de San Marcos, or even at Fort Matanzas, which is the other one. It's another fort that you can go to in St. Augustine. It's on one of the further like barrier islands, and it's much smaller. But even that, like, it's built with like the really thick coquina stone, whereas this had earthen walls and like the hutched roofs that the natives were using. And actually, if you look at it on page 5, you can see a map of where that is.
So were there 2 forts?
Yeah. So there you got 2 forts there. So you got the big one, Castillo de San Marcos, and like right there, that is the heart of St. Augustine. And then up to the north, you've got the little one, so that's Fort Mose.
Okay. Makes more sense. I'm with the program.
Technically, the community had a Spanish officer who was in charge of the settlement, but the real recognized leader of the settlement was Francisco Menendez. And the next slide has a picture of him. Menendez was a Mandinga born in 1704 in West Africa. He was captured and sold into British slavery before the 1720s. So before he's 16, he is already in British slavery. He escaped and fought with the Yamasee tribes against the English, eventually making his way to St. Augustine. Here, he was again made a slave. So just another example, like when he got to St. Augustine, he was still considered a slave at that time. And he served as captain of the town's black militia. After he served bravely, he petitioned for him and his men's freedom, which was granted in 1738, at which point that's when Fort Mose is built and he is placed in charge of the settlement at Fort Mose. So really brave guy, really powerful guy. He seems like he was really, really well liked. And like I said, he wasn't technically the leader. Like on paper, there was the Spanish guy in charge. But everyone that lived there was like, this is our guy.
Logistically speaking, yeah.
In 1740, so just 2 years after Fort Mose is built and established, the British siege Mose. So the British come in and they take it. The governor orders that the community retreat to St. Augustine. So all of the, it's families there. It's men, women, children. So they all retreat back to St. Augustine. So you think of that map, like you got the big Castillo de San Marcos. They're going back there. But only 16 days later, so just barely 2 weeks after, a defensive battalion of Spanish soldiers, the Fort Mose militia, led by our guy Francisco Menendez, and Yamasee warriors, surprised the British in an early morning attack. They quickly reclaimed Fort Mose. British casualties were high. They kicked their butts. And the incident became known as the Battle of Bloody Mose. And basically, like, the losses were so bad that the British troops retreated from Spanish Florida and were like, nope, we're out. Not worth it. Yep.
We're done.
Now, unfortunately, in the process, the fort was destroyed, like we're talking about. Like, it wasn't made with the big coquina stones. It was earthen walled and everything. So the fort was completely destroyed. So the Mosaic community moved back into St. Augustine for the next decade or so. Now, depending on the source, you'll read that at this time in St. Augustine, the population was very diverse and most of the community was intermarried and very well integrated, which is definitely in part true. Like, there was a lot of intermarriage. Everyone was very integrated. It was very diverse. You had natives, you had Spanish, you had second generation Spanish, you had Africans, you had, escaped slaves, all of that.
Which is probably really good.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I would assume.
It seems like the culture was really interesting, and you would have like influences of Spanish and African culture and all of that. I think it's still important to note that while intermarriage was accepted, there was still a very complicated and specific social structure tied in with race in St. Augustine and the other Spanish colonies in South America. So I actually have a picture of this. It is going to be slide 9. And basically, there's a super highly organized system for identifying the precise genetic heritage of an individual. So full-blood Africans were known as Morenos. People of mixed African, European, Indian ancestry were known as castas, with other nomenclature depending on their heritage. For example, if Spaniard married a Morena woman, their children would be mulattoes. If a mulatto married a Spaniard, their children would be known as moriscos. The children of Spaniards and Native Americans were called mestizos. So,
wow.
It
Okay.
is more progressive in the fact that, like, yeah, there's intermarriage and everything, but we're still keeping track of who you are, what you are, and that's going to
Still very
it's still
political,
very political,
essentially.
and it's still like lots of it's still a race-based system, still a lot of colorism happening. So I just want to highlight, like, colonial Spain is definitely the hero in the story, sort of, but it doesn't mean that they're doing everything or anything completely right. Like, it,
They're still not changing the rules. They're still following like almost
yeah, it's
society,
just a different version that
essentially.
obviously is a bit more accepting, but still complicated. And I mean, that's just the reality of it. Is like history's complicated. Nobody's ever like perfectly right. What is perfectly right? And on that note, let's keep going because that's a loaded question. So in 1752, 12 years after the British attack in 1740, so 12 years later, Fort Mose was rebuilt in a slightly different location, same general area, but just slightly different. And the Spanish government insisted that much of St. Augustine's black population move back to the settlement and keep the post. So I saw it phrased a couple different ways. I saw, oh, the governor said, go back. We have this land. Have your settlement again. And then I also saw it listed where it was like they were getting worried because there were like over 100 black people in their community. And they're like, I don't know. This feels kind of like we might be getting outnumbered or whatever. You have to go back here. This is where you are. This is your settlement. So it kind of hints a little like segregation-y. Um,
Yeah, we're still gonna divide up essentially, and we're still separating, and you're gonna have to go here,
Yeah, we're happier if you're
basically.
2 miles away. And also, like, good, you can keep lookout for us and serve. And I mean, and also,
Yeah,
like, a
you're
lot
gonna
of
be
the
the
guys, like, a
first.
lot of the men are part of the military. So there's a little bit of that aspect to it as well. But anyway, much of St. Augustine's black population moved back to the settlement to keep the post. They also farmed, hunted, fished. There were 67 residents living in 22 houses. So it's actually smaller than the original fort. Like the original fort had about 100 people, 38 families, and this one has 67 people. Now, in 1763, just 11 years after Fort Mose is rebuilt. So it was built in 38. 2 years later, British destroy it. 12 years later, they build it again, and everyone moves back. And now, 11 years later, Fort Mose is rebuilt, but Spain trades Florida to the British in a peace treaty of the French and Indian War. So at this point, Florida is now no longer Spanish controlled, it is actually British controlled. So many of St. Augustine's residents, Spanish, Black, and Native American, moved to Spanish held Cuba to maintain their freedoms as opposed to be under British rule. And in 1763, Fort Mose is abandoned permanently.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's a little bit of a bummer because it's not like the longest lived community, especially with being destroyed for like 12 years in there. Um, but I did think it was really interesting that a lot of St. Augustine at that point was like, we are out. We're going to Cuba. And it's so
Yeah,
it's
that's also long. That's also again another very hard trip to
definitely, yeah, it's
make.
a very hard trip. I mean, travel and in any form during this time is just atrocious and like a death sentence, I feel like. But that might be a little dramatic. But I think it's interesting that like everybody had reasons for wanting to go. And a lot of it's because they did have different, even if it wasn't a perfect system, they had different freedoms under Spanish rule. So, like, Africans that stayed risked being put back into slavery, even if they were free, even if they did own property. Native Americans that stayed. So, like, you have people that were like born, raised there, like actually local. We're like, nope, we're Catholic now. We're just going to go to Cuba. It'll be better for us there than to stay here under British rule. And then obviously you got Spaniards and Catholics that are just like, we're going to move because British at this time is Protestant. And it's a very big deal that
Yeah.
it's still that there's separation there. So that is where our story ends for now. When I started on this topic, I had no idea that Fort Mose was even a thing. I never really thought about Florida as being a source of asylum for slaves. I think I always thought about it more in the 1800s antebellum, like heart of the deep South. Like you're in Florida, oh man, it's going to be really bad. But prior to that, it was actually a source of asylum. Um, the more I got into it, the history continues to get really interesting from here. And I don't know that I'm going to do a part 2. Honestly, it could be a part 2 and part 3. But we are certainly going to cover, moving forward in future episodes. So I do have some good news, though, about Fort Mose. So it was abandoned in 1763, since everyone was fleeing. The structure fell into disrepair, and of course, 200 years of weather removed most of the evidence of the fort. But the area was established as a state park in 1989, so you now have the Fort Mose State Park, and it's managed by Anastasia State Recreation Area, which is one of Maegan and I's favorite places to go camping and go to the beach on St. Augustine. It's recognized as a national landmark of historical significance, and it's a 40-acre waterfront site and includes a visitor center and small museum. Admission to the park is free, and the museum only costs $2. So next time I'm in St. Augustine, it's definitely on the list, and it's free to kids under 6. So if you've got a family, be sure to go check it out. Now, in the 1980s, museum archaeologist Kathy Deegan discovered and excavated the site and helped put together an exhibit that traveled the country. So they found where it was, based off of maps and everything. They found stains in the soil where wooden posts had once stood. They found a filled-in moat that surrounded the fort and some modest artifacts from people's daily lives. So like buttons, thimbles, nails, musket balls, pipes, etc. In 1990, fundraising efforts began to rebuild the fort. And as of 2024, it looks like they have secured all the funding and that a groundbreaking ceremony was held. And from what I can tell, the project is almost complete. And actually, the last slide on there shows the groundbreaking.
You've been here? Yes, that's why I was just looking it up, because I was like, I swear just went here recently. Like, I feel like I recognize this and stuff. Yes, Jared and I just went when we went up to St. Augustine last to go camping. We stopped because they were doing, I'll have to I'm trying to look it up real quick, and maybe you're about to say it yourself, but they, I think have finished rebuilding the fort. I'm pretty sure it's done by now, because shortly after I was there, I was supposed to be able to come back like a couple weeks later, and they were going to be opening it up on their opening and I think they were going to do like a cannon launch, or I could be wrong, but they were going to do something to, whatever. But I'm pretty sure it is open now, unless it did get delayed, which would make sense. It's Florida weather, whatever the case may be. But it is pretty cool. I have done the trails. I did their little walkthrough trail. They did have a lot of it closed off because they were doing construction and like rebuilding and stuff. And it has a great walkout area, like a boardwalk and stuff. And it's pretty cool. And the museum looks really great.
Awesome. Very cool. No, that's awesome. I'm so glad you've been.
Probably just hijacked that, but.
Well, that's neat. Is it cool now knowing more of the history behind it?
Yeah, it makes sense. Because I thought I started realizing, like, once you started talking about the British and the Spain, and Spain, and kind of talking about, I was like, I'm pretty sure they have like it's great for anyone. They have like a little walkthrough. They have like some signs set up and stuff that kind of go a little bit, not as in detail, of course, but go a little bit in depth of what you were just talking about and the history of it all. And just kind of like, what they were going through.
Cool.
And what type of, I guess, like terrain and stuff. And so it's pretty cool. I really liked it. It is definitely something that you could do the same day if you went to Anastasia State Park or you're in St. Augustine. You could definitely do both of those in like one day and do it like it's a little history day.
Very cool. It's cool. That's awesome. Yeah, it's definitely on my list next time I'm up in that area. I know that the park hosts a lot of events. You're probably right. It probably is open at this point. I just was like struggling to find exact dates of stuff. But they host reenactments of the Battle of Bloody Mose. And they're actually, the day that we're doing this, they're doing like a interactive like 3-day thing, February 20th through the 22nd. They'll do the Battle of Bloody Mose. They're going to be talking and like showing examples of reenactments of the Underground Railroad system that went there. Yeah,
that's so cool.
I know. I was like, we recorded this too late, but it's literally happening today as we record this, which will be like 2 weeks in the past when you hear it. They also have a cool concert series that they're doing there. So if you're ever in the area, be sure to check it out. They've got a Facebook website. I'll link it in the description. and Megan's been, so that's really cool.
Yeah, I've been. When I was there was a big bird watching group that was there. So if you are into bird watching, they do have a big group. And from what I heard and what I saw, there was quite a few species, I
That makes
guess. I don't know.
sense.
I don't know. They were saying they were all very excited, and it seemed like it was a very big group and a very big thing. So yeah, it seems to be really great. And then
What
it's
was
cool. I
the
liked it.
beachfront like? Is it like sandy beaches or is it
So there was
okay?
no beach.
That
It's
makes sense.
marshy. It's I feel like I could definitely have seen a couple of gators if it was sunny out and things. But it was very marsh,
Nice.
very
Cool.
swampy, kind of what we were talking about, like trying to get through. It's nothing great. Very open, very big and wide.
Neat.
So I thought it was pretty
Very
cool.
cool. Awesome. Would you have any thoughts or anything you want to add about the episode before we close out?
No, I think it's so cool that I've been to that park and then I had no idea this much history about it. And now that like I could go back and be like, oh, I actually really understand this now. And like I know what this is talking about. So I think that's
All
pretty
right. Well,
cool. Definitely and very exciting. I definitely want a part two at some point of St. Augustine because St. Augustine I think has so much to unpack and so much
I think we're going
interesting
to end up
things.
coming to St. Augustine
Um,
so many times because the part 2 and part 3 that I'm talking about is really just about like the Black African American experience all the way up. I had no idea how critical St. Augustine was to the civil rights movement. I had no idea how critical St. Augustine was to um, the Civil War, actually. So yeah, there's so much
yeah,
more to cover. And then there's also so many other aspects of St. Augustine, like you've got the Spanish missions. Um, it's just crazy. So we're definitely going to be coming back to that at some point. It's so funny when you first start, you're like, are we going to have enough things to talk about? And then you start researching, you're like, there's so much to talk about.
there's so much and you're like trying to cut back and like make it work. You're like, I don't know. Am I losing my mind here? I don't know. It's like a
I thought it
weird
was really
feeling.
interesting too how many things in history cycle through. And so like I think sometimes we tend to think that like things just continually get better. It's just linear. Like everything is just always like, oh, we're always getting a little bit kinder and like we're learning to treat people better. And the reality is that it's more of like a pendulum swinging back and forth where like the
Yeah.
ancient Romans were doing slavery more humanely than we were in the 1800s. And like in the 1750s there was a huge need for this underground railroad network. And then in the 1850s, once again, like it's just very interesting the way that things swing. I think it's like a little frustrating because you would think that like shouldn't we just be getting better as humans? And then also it's kind of encouraging because it's like, well, just because things are getting bad doesn't mean they're going to stay bad. It just means that action has to be taken.
That is definitely a very interesting way to like that. It's like again, it's not always necessarily going to stay bad. I did find it interesting. Well, I guess I don't know why I find it so interesting, but I did find it interesting about just kind of like how political everything was. Like I feel like sometimes everything is so political now and everything's based on that. But then like when you really think about it and you're going back, it's like everything's always been very political. And so it's very interesting what their versions of, oh, well, that decision was made and that was extremely political. And it's very interesting to see kind of what their version of their political
Yeah,
was.
exactly. Exactly. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for today. Thank you guys for listening. Please like, subscribe, share wherever you listen. We're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, Apple Podcast. If you have any recommendations on what we should cover, we're definitely open to like hearing what you guys want to hear about. So email us at ourfloridapodcast@gmail.com. If you've enjoyed listening or learned something new, please give us a 5-star review wherever you listen. And if you can send this podcast to a friend, it would be super helpful just for getting the word out there. We're in a little bit of a niche category, being focused just on Florida. So if you can share with all your Florida friends, neighbors, vacationers, that would be super, super helpful. Megan, want to give us a teaser as to what animal we'll be learning about on Friday?
Yeah, so we will be in St. Augustine and we'll be going in a little bit into, oh no, we'll definitely be in Anastasia State Park. And like we talked a little bit about we go there a lot for camping, the beaches, a lot of different things. But we will be talking about a rodent.
Ooh.
And that's all I'll say. You guys will have to listen to the Friday episode to learn more about that. The little rodent is what we'll be talking about.
Awesome. All right. Bye, guys. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.